Okay, I'm Bob again, I'm an alcoholic. So I'm going to run through my recovery and my experiences using the steps as a way to run through. I am not going to just go through the book. I'm not going to do it in a formal way. I'm going to do it in a kind of an informal way. It's kind of intimidating doing this. This is difficult for me. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this process because I feel somewhat exposed in it, but I've done it a few times and I'm going to do it again. In the course of talking for the next 2 sessions, you talk enough, and if you're not careful, you probably will say a few things. If you get me back in 2 years or something, I'll take a look at that and say, well, I didn't mean exactly that. But I'm just going to have a conversation with you about my recovery and about how I use the steps and about how they operate in my life today. And I'm not going to be cautious, and I'm not going to just run through the book. There are more teachings about the steps in Alcoholics Anonymous probably than there ever has been. You can go over to the table over there and you can get 12 steps by probably 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 different people who are active members of both our AA and Al-Anon fellowships who share their experience with the steps. We're becoming more didactic and more teachy about the steps and a little bit more formal, which I think is what happens to all organizations, human organizations, as they move on. They tend to get more rigid, and they tend to get more formal, and they tend to get more stratified. Our book, I believe, without question, is inspired. I think the nature of great spiritual books is that when you read them, you actually don't just get information. When you read them, you actually have an experience. So when you read the big book for other than just getting information or facts, or you read the 12 and 12, I think it draws you in, and there's a newness to it. You go read it and you say, where was that before? You know, what was going on there? And there's a newness to it because the book engages you in such a way that I think you have the opportunity for actual spiritual experiences in the study and the reading of the book. There are people who are experts in the book. There are people who know that first 164 pages a lot better than I do. But some of those people have trouble living, and some of those people I don't want to go on a fishing trip with. Okay. The book is the menu. It is not the food. The food is when you put the principles that are in the book and put the principles that are in a step through your life. The food is the alteration in your life and the experience you have with your increased consciousness of God. That's the food. The book is the directions, it is not the journey. Any idiot can memorize 164 pages. The living of it is difficult. I am not up here because I'm an expert in living, and I'm up here because I've been an active member of AA almost 35 years. So I'm just going to tell you what I do, what works, what doesn't work, and try to give you some sense of that. The steps are not mechanical. There is more precise teaching about the steps than there has ever been. And sometimes in the precise teaching about the steps, you get the idea that if I go through that process, I will be guaranteed that I will have the change that I need to have. And I want to say yes and no. First of all, I want to say that going through the process mechanically is better than not going through it. I want to be absolutely clear about that. You have to start through that process. But the change is spiritual. Surrender is not something that you can easily instruct someone on how to surrender, because I think it's a spiritual event. You could point to it, but when you point to it, you know, when the master points to the moon, all the idiot sees is the finger. You know, there's something else that has to happen in that process. Because it's spiritual and not mechanical. If it was mechanical, all we'd have to do anytime we had a problem is say the third step prayer and click your heels, we'd be back in Kansas. I mean, there would be no issue, would there? I mean, if it was mechanical, we'd have the magic handshake and we'd all get together and we'd hold hands in a circle and we'd say the prayer. I mean, whatever was there would be gone. And believe me, I am not trying to belittle the power that is in this process, and I'm not trying to belittle those of us that regularly go through the steps and don't have much change. There are times when I am dry and I go through that process with the intention of having something happening and I don't get much out of the process. So there has to be a way, the steps are an alteration in being. Ultimately, what I think the program is transformational. It is not linear. It transforms lives. It doesn't just change lives. We talk about change. And the mind, what the mind does with the word change is I think it makes it linear. Oh yeah, I've been trying to stop this and do that. That's what I'll do. But the actual change for most of us when it happens isn't like that. The actual change is that something internal happens and we have a spiritual experience and that thing just falls away. It didn't just happen by muscle or by information or by an event. It happened in a different way. So we have to bring something to the process to make, I think, to make the steps alive. There certainly has to be some element of surrender. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That's pretty hard to bring. There has to be some element of humility, which obviously would be included in surrender. But there has to be, if we're full of ego, there's no room to learn anything. There's no room to change anything. There's no room to hear anything. Most of us think we come to the process like a clean slate. I mean, I laugh at that. You know, human beings as a group have genetic engineering over tens of thousands of years. About half of what we have is just our genetic engineering. And then we have the specific genetics of our family, the characteristics and personalities of our family, plus the cultural conditioning of our family, of our religion, of our community, of being male or being female, of being middle class or upper class or lower class, all that conditioning in school. And then you have the conditioning of your own, you know, the ego that you constructed after you went out and experienced the world and built your fort, built your tank. I mean, we're all driving around in a tank with a slit, with a machine gun, looking out the slit, driving around, okay? You built that tank and you spent your life decorating it, okay? Who's got the nicest tank? Who's got new hubcaps on the tank? We've spent so much time and invested so much in the tank, we forget we're the driver. We're more worried about who has the best model, who has the most expensive tank. Okay? We're not the tank, we're the driver. So we have literally in the process of constructing, we started out filled up about 75%, and by the time our ego gets constructed, there's almost no room to hear anything. In order for us to really learn anything different, there has to be some deflation of ego in order for there to be an opening for us to hear anything. We are not a blank slate. We are conditioned. Every thought, every word, every idea that comes out of our mouth could be traced, many of us, back to our parents and our school and our neighborhood. We are not original thinkers. We may have a little personality that gets blocked into things, but we so underestimate the conditioning that we grew up in. Now we're responsible. It isn't like there isn't a choice. It isn't like if that's the way it is, why would you ever interact with that? Because that's not the way it is. It is an illusion, but that's the way thinking is. The process of growth in the program is not a process of thinking. It's a spiritual process, and it happens someplace else. It happens in spirit, and it happens in your heart, and it happens in intuition, not just in your mind and in thought. So I think to really get the full measure of what I need out of the program, it's every bit as important about how I be and what I bring to that process than what I do. In every sponsee in the world, when they're having trouble, they always want to know what to do. I mean, that's always the question. And most of the time, every once in a while when they come over to the house for the half-hour session, you keeping track of time? Yes. Every once in a while when they come over to the house for the half-hour session and they lay the thing on you that's not working, I say, close your eyes. Be quiet. Pretend I came to your house and just had the conversation with you that you just had with me. Tell me what to do. They always know. No, they do. We have a place inside of us that always knows. The problem is they can't do it. The problem is lack of power, lack of willingness. The problem is not knowing. Okay? So I want to say that when I'm talking about the steps, and I'm talking about spiritual principles in the steps, I want to be clear that I think they're bigger than the words. They're bigger than me. I am not an expert on them. I am every bit as intimidated and every bit as needy in the process of doing the steps as you are. I may have some more experience than you, and I will try to give that to you, but I'll tell you, there's no such thing as an expert, because when you're in the territory of God and when you're in the territory of spirituality, it's always new. Life is fired at you at point blank range. You don't get used to living life. Life is always new. And when you want to alter something that's been in place, it's a tremendous stretching experience for anybody who's inside of it. So now I'm going to walk through the steps, and I'm going to talk about how they were when I first came in and talk a little bit about how they are today. Step one, that we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. Bill talks about in the 12 and 12 that step one is probably the only step we can do perfectly. That we've been so beaten to a pulp by the process of alcoholism and drug dependency that we are on our knees when we come in. Bill says later on in the book that most of the people were low-bottom drunks as they came in early in Alcoholics Anonymous, and the surrender experience for many of them was profound. Today, when we see people come in, many of them are earlier on in the process of alcoholism. It's that part where Bill talks about we're going to raise the bottom up to the person so they can have a surrender experience in a different place. They do not have to go as far. It's a movie. You don't have to watch the movie all the way to the end. All you have to do is identify the fact you're in the movie. You're on a garbage truck. Once you identify it's going to the dump, you don't have to drive it to the dump. You can get off it. Okay. But many of those men, and I was often taken by Chamberlain, I really think there are 2 or 3 men that I would say that I believe in my experiences forfeited their lives when they got sober. They didn't view their lives as their own. They viewed their lives as belonging to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. It wasn't like they didn't have egos. It wasn't as if they weren't personalities. But there was something about the way that man talked. Not only did he almost physically die the day he went to the hospital to quit drinking, the experience he had in his very early recovery and the surrender experience was profound. To the extent that we have a surrender experience is to the extent that we have an opening. What we're talking about, the 2 places that I see it in the book the most was, there's 2 places. One is where Young sees it, but Silkworth is writing in the book of the doctor's opinion, and I love this part. He said, after they have succumbed to the desire to drink again, as they so often do and the phenomenon of craving develop, they pass through the well-known stages of spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution never to drink again. This is repeated over and over unless the person can experience an entire psychic change. There is very little hope for their recovery. The book in about 7 or 8 places start talking about, if this is true, you're suffering from a disease that only a spiritual experience will cure. Over and over and over again, the book is talking about alcoholism is a problem that if you have it, you cannot solve it yourself. Information will not solve it yourself. What you need is access to a power greater than yourself. Period. End of story. They said that's what this book is about accessing that power. But Silkworth goes on to say, on the other hand, as strange as it may seem to those who do not understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he despaired over ever solving them, suddenly, that word is used maybe a dozen times in the program. Not like after 6 years. Suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol. The only effort necessary is that he follow a few simple rules. Jung talked about trying to have that moral change, that psychological change with Roland Hazard he was talking about. He was talking about trying to bring that about. So what we're talking about, the surrender experience, which is what I believe those men are talking about, for most of us when we came in, it was as teachable as we ever got. To the degree we were surrenderable, was to the degree we were teachable when we came in. Most of us had enough problems directly because of our alcoholism and because of the chaos in our lives. that we had some sort of surrender experience. The pain of my life was very significant. The pain of my life drowned out my ego. When I came in, I was ready to listen to it. I didn't know much about alcoholism, but as I learned more about alcoholism, I saw how it impacted my life, and I started to believe what you told me about alcoholism. AA was a place where, I don't know, I felt like it was a school for me. I felt like it was I felt like I was home. I felt like it was addressing the very issues that were going on in my soul. I was astounded. I was only 23 years old. I was astounded to hear people 50 years old talking about issues that I felt when I was 20. The reason I was able to identify is when I read the stories, I hadn't gone as far as some of those people had in the disease of alcoholism, but I felt every feeling that those people had in those stories. I so identified with that thing. Today, I've got 34 years of sobriety. Someone said, am I powerless over alcohol? My life's unmanageable? Yes. I'll tell you something. I struggle with the fact of being less surrendered today than I was in my first year of sobriety. What you start to rely on is what you know. You can pass the test. Someone hands out the book, the blue book, for the test. What's the test? We all know how to answer. We know the answers to the questions. The fact is, with most of the serious issues in our life, if you want to get laid, are we going to give that problem to God? Okay. I mean, if you want, if you're going to the gambling casino and you want to make a couple of grand, you're going to give that problem to God? I mean, the fact is, are we powerless and are we unmanageable? Do we really believe that the problems and issues in our life today need a power greater than ourselves, or are we the people that are going to manage it? This is for sex or money, I'll handle this, the rest of the stuff God handles. And I think that the evidence is, if you want to take a look, not at the words, because all of us know what the answer is. If you take a look at how we live our lives, many of us often don't live our lives like we are powerless and unmanageable. We live our lives like we've received some sort of truth in the program of AA, and we can apply that truth. We can apply the steps. It's very subtle. But I'm telling you, the attitude involved in that is not one of surrender. It is not one of powerlessness. It is not one of unmanageability. It is one of control, and it is one of us applying the deal. And I believe that that is the single most. You only have two choices in life. You're either your ego and intellect's in charge, or you're God-centered. Chamberlain used to say, either have a self-centered life and suffer the consequences, or you have a God-centered life and suffer the consequences. End of story. And I think that is the issue. I think that there are two curbs on the street. And one curb is God-centered and one curb is self-centered. And we swing sometimes like a pendulum in that space. And in that, and depending upon where you are, how centered or not centered you are, your experience of life is very different. When your ego's in charge, you're your tank. You're separate, you're different, you're comparing yourself, and you're all there is. You're out there to win and have others lose. You're out there to be right and make others wrong, and you're out there trying to look good. That's all you got. When you're centered, for those moments that when we're centered in God, for whatever reason, there's a feeling like it's okay. There's a feeling like I'm not alone. It's a very different experience when you're centered. So I want to say that most of us intellectually assume that we have no issue with the first step. And I say that one of the reasons we don't have the experience that we sometimes like with the subsequent steps is that we don't go back and try to access something that smells of surrender or smells of humility. It's not an easy thing to do. But what the mind does, when the mind's in control, the mind relies on what it knows. Knowledge, self-knowledge will not resolve the problems we have in our life. Many of the issues we have in our life are expressions and very closely connected with our disease of alcoholism. And that's the alteration that we're looking for, not the partial answer, not just abstinence, if we're looking for a quieting of the noise in our head, if we're looking for a peace that surpasses understanding, and the amount of time Bill uses peace in this book is extraordinary, in the 12 and 12. If we're looking for that long-range solution, that comes from accessing a power greater than ourselves, not from information and not from self-knowledge. Step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves to restore us to sanity. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had significant religious problems. As soon as the Catholic Church was very important to me. I almost went in the priesthood. I was an altar boy, I had all those sorts of things, and as soon as I learned how to masturbate and drink, I was in serious conflict with the church. And it didn't seem as funny in those days as it does today. But it was a pretty serious, because this was not an unimportant aspect of my life and not an unimportant part for me. And to feel alienated from it, so I became angry, scared, all those sorts of things, and I was in conflict with it and never resolved that conflict from the time I walked in, to AA. And there were a lot of other behaviors, dishonesty and sexual and financial and other sorts of things that I was out of integrity with when I came in. So I had plenty of things to be out of conflict with. My blood pressure used to go up just driving by a church. In St. Paul, you drive by a lot of them. And when I came into AA, I can't tell you how warm I felt by the distinction between spirituality and religion. We had a thing called Calyx, and I'm not dissing anybody who goes to Calyx, but it was for Catholic alcoholics. And a couple of old-timers wanted me to go to it. I went to it. It was the last thing I wanted. I so loved AA, I did not want to drag my conflicts with the church into my recovery. The recovery was the only place in my life I felt good about. It was the only place in my life that seemed to be working. Everything else about my life was going to hell in a handbasket, and I didn't want to contaminate it with the conflicts that I had around the church. So they made the clear distinction that what we're talking about is spiritual principles, not theology. What we're talking about is that you will start to see God and work in people's lives. The first thing I noticed is that the conversations they were having in AA weren't all about drinking. I'd stay after the meeting till 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, and the old-timer, they were talking about guys having fights with their wives, having problems at work, they were going over guys' bills, they were talking about making amends. Not much talk about not drinking. They were talking about how to live. And I kind of got the idea, it was confusing for me for a significant period of time, but I quickly got the idea that these guys really were pretty serious about applying these steps to their lives and about changing their lives. I remember we had a party for a guy who took 14 years to pay off his debts. We had it was a debt burn. It was very cool. And I thought, my God, to write that check out or those checks out every month for 14 years, impressive, and pretty classy, okay? So I came in, there was no question that the men and women in that group represented a power greater than myself. My first power greater than myself was Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the people, the men and women in that group. As I progressed, the steps, I started to have some access to the steps in a way that the steps we access at all sorts of levels. We read them, we study about them, we, quote, do them, but they also become part of the fabric of your life. They literally become part of who you be in the living of your life. So the steps just show up in some of your decisions and some of your actions as you go along. As they started to be incorporated into my life, my sense of connection with the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and my sense that Alcoholics Anonymous had a total answer for me was my connection with God. I have looked lots of different places. I've studied a lot of different things, but I always drag it back into AA and bring it into my cave and somehow try to recapitulate it and talk about it in a way that works, or I hope it works, within the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, rather than depart from AA. Well, so I have never felt that since I've been in sobriety, like I didn't have some access to some power, either by God, by the people in the group, or by the steps. When I was in trouble, and when you get in trouble, you're in pain, and when you're in pain, you get pretty self-involved in the early parts of that pain, and when you're self-involved, you feel very separate, you feel very different, you feel very unique. when I was in that spot over a long period of time, when my life looked like it wasn't going to be okay, when I was a real active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I lost the belief in the second step. And I say that a lot of us have trouble with the second step and don't identify it because intellectually we say, yeah, do you believe God's going to restore you to sanity? Of course. Like a no-brainer. Well, I'm telling you, it was like an aha for me at 7 years of sobriety to find out that at that point in time, I didn't believe it. I believed it was going to work for you, but I believed I was going backwards. I believed I was kind of on my way out, or that I was failing in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous because I had very significant living issues over a period of time. I'm telling you that you do the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th step, 6th and 7th step, very differently if the first 2 steps are alive than when they are not alive. So when I did that at 8 years of sobriety, when I took that 4th and 5th step, and I see people all the time, what they do when their lives are unmanageable, they go back and do a 4th step. Because the theory is if I get more information, I'll know what to do. The problem is they already know what to do and they have all the information there is. They may not have it consciously, but they have it. So writing about it may help a little bit, but it's going to be incremental. It is not going to be transformational. If you want to access transformation, we better go backwards and make sure that we have 1, 2, and 3 alive, in operation, accessible, because only to the degree that those 3 steps are alive are we going to have much juice in doing 4, 5, 6, and 7. So I had to go back and reclaim the second step for myself. I still today have to go back and reclaim that for myself. Because what I tend to rely on today is the habits I have today are better. I know how to work today. I'm reasonably successful in business. So when I have issues with money, or I have issues at home, or I have issues I try to manage them. Okay? My first instinct is just to do whatever the hell there is to do. Now, some of that's appropriate. Some of it is I'm supposed to be involved in the process. But there's a very big difference between operating out of your ego and intellect and you being there, that when I am in connection with God, when I am partners, and I have found out that the way I live my life best is in partnership. I think my life is ever so much better because I'm partnered with my wife. It just is the way that I'm grateful for that. I've got a business partner I've been partnered with for 32 years. He's 38 years sober. Now, we have had a lot of issues. We've had a lot of arguments over a long period of time, so it's been like another marriage over a period of time. But I like to do things with other people. I can even clean the garage if someone comes over. It's almost like if I had to wait to clean the garage myself, it'd never happen. But when someone else is there, it just alters my whole experience. Well, when I'm centered and I feel like I am in the hand of God, or that I'm connected to a power greater than myself, I'm not alone. That noise in my head isn't nearly as loud as it is when I'm alone. I feel connected to you in a way, much more connected to you than I do when I'm not centered. And I think that many of us, during the problem areas of our lives, during the dry periods, and during the time the problems are most prominent, lose the belief in the second step. And we do not think that we need a power greater than ourselves to resolve this issue. One of the reasons we all have a problem with the power greater than ourselves is who God has become. If I had to say what is the religion of today, the religion of today is psychology. Never have we, when I came in the 60s, if you looked up psychiatrists or psychologists and looked them up in the phone book, there would have been 2 or 3 pages of psychiatrists and psychologists. If you looked up counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists today, there's 100 times more of those professionals today than there ever has been. I'm not knocking it, but I'm telling you, psychology is not powerful enough to transport you where you have to go to have spiritual transformation. It gives you insight. It may be deeper than information. It may be helpful, and it may even be necessary in some of the processes that we go through. But ultimately, you have to access something greater than yourself, outside of yourself, and it has to be, or not outside of yourself in a physical sense, because God is within. You have to access God to have the changes that I think that most of us have to do. And psychology is not strong enough in most cases to do that alone. We have to access that power. So, as I say, most of us assume that we have that power and that we intellectually we have that decision. But again, if you look at the evidence of our lives, how alone we feel, how scared we are, how we try to manage and implement and control the people around us and the circumstances around us, there's a hell of a lot of evidence in my daily life from time to time that I don't believe that I'm powerless or unmanageable, or that I have come to believe that God is going to restore me to balance and sanity. And then I make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, as I understand it. The book, interestingly enough, talks about, every once in a while I hear someone talk about the fourth step as into action. You know, that we start talking about that first action step in the program of AA is the fourth step. The 12 and 12 refers to the third step as the first time we have to do action. But the other two were, the first two were not action steps. We could do those sitting in our chair. But the third step is an active sense of turning our will, that the process of making that decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God is an action. Okay, and it's an interesting phenomenon because it's a different kind of action than it is, making a list. When I came into AA, I turned my will and my life over to the care of Alcoholics Anonymous. In my early sobriety, especially the first 9 months of my sobriety, that was the easiest thing I ever did. It was just every time I went to a meeting and learned something new, I heard something different. I was excited about the principles. I liked the people. I liked what they said. I liked how they said it. It was just like this. Then when I started getting into my defects of character, it got to be more meddling, than I thought was going on, but a little bit harder. But for my first 2 years, I had no problem with turning my will and my life over to the care of Alcoholics Anonymous as I knew it, and over to the care of God as I understood God, and my understanding was not nearly what it is today. Today, I find out that I have great difficulty in that, because what I rely on is what I know. I know too much. One of the famous men in Zen who wrote a book, Suzuki, wrote a book called Beginner's Mind. Okay? And what he's recommending and what you want to do, you want to have the mind of a beginner, because an expert can't learn anything. An expert is full. There is no place to bring something to teach the expert. Okay? So what you want, you got an announcement?
Okay, we need a couple cars moved. License plate NVS 200, it's a black Buick. An NJR 783, it's a Chevy, red or burgundy. They need to put those tents up, and they're blocking that.
So even though intellectually, again, there's a real difference between bottom line where we say, yeah, I made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. I'm a very active member of AA, and that's where I do it, and that's how I do it. But I think a lot of us do it at the level of intellect and don't do it at the level of heart, and often take it back. And the biggest problem I have today is turning my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand God. That I do it at the level of intellect, and I don't do it at the level of intuition, and I don't do it at the level of spirit. My first tendency is to rely on my information. My first tendency is to do what I know needs to be done. And there's a difference in how we be. There's a difference between how we behave. There's a difference between how we feel when we're powerless and unmanageable, that we believe that God's going to restore things to balance and sanity when we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. When I'm in that place, I can be present to whatever goes on in my life. When I'm in that place, I know the difference between life circumstances and my life. When I am not present, I think the circumstances are my life. When I am present to turning my will and my life over to the care of God, I am clear that the circumstances are not my life. And I can be with the circumstances. When you can be in front of what's going on in your life, you can attend to it and you can manage it. When you can't be with it, it manages you. When I could not be with my alcoholism managed me. There was a tremendous change when I could be with my alcoholism. When I could accept the fact that I was alcoholic, I could stand in front of it naked and see it for what it was and interact with it. Prior to that, in my denial, I couldn't be in front of it, I couldn't accept it, and it ran my life. When you're not alone, and Bill makes very clear, what does he say in the 12 and 12 in step 1? I mean, it's one of the most powerful things. He said, define that he should prove beyond a doubt by any immense experience. This is one of the facts of AA life. The principle that we find no enduring strength until we first admit complete defeat is the main taproot from which our whole society sprung and flows. The fact that we will find no enduring strength until we first admit complete defeat is the main taproot from which our whole society springs. Now, I think all of us understand that in early sobriety, but I think a lot of us have trouble having that be the guiding fact of our lives in middle sobriety and beyond. And it's the assumption because we know the words, because we can answer the questions on the test, because we know the answer, because we know what to do and we can direct people to do it, is that it's alive. And I say for a lot of us, it's the menu. We need, hear people say, read the black part. Like all you got to do is read the black part. Like that's going to get you to God. Transport, what are we, idiots? Read the black part. Of course, what else would you read? But it isn't just the words on the page. It is putting the principles in those words in action in our lives and causing an alteration in how we see things. Where Jung talks about, when he talks to Roland Hazard, I love the words that he uses. There's two things that I want to read when I talk about the spiritual alteration that we're talking about. One's on page 25, and it says, the great fact for us is this and nothing less, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experience which revolutionized our whole attitude towards life, towards our fellows and towards God, the universe. The central fact for us, for our lives today, is that absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our heart and lives in a way that is indeed miraculous. He has commenced to accomplish those things for us that we could not do for ourselves. Jung says, when Roland Hazard said, isn't there an exception to what you're talking about? He said, yeah, there's an exception. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what they call vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena, okay, not usual. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men and women, were suddenly cast aside, and a complete new set of conceptions, motives began to dominate them. And that's what I think happens in the process of taking the steps. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes that once were the guiding forces in our lives, the fear, the anxiety, the sense of difference, the self-centeredness, the ego direction that we had, were suddenly cast aside when we had our surrender experience and we had an opening. Today, with the issues that we struggle with in our lives, we need to try to recreate that opening. And I believe that is the job of the first 3 steps. And do not assume that we own those steps because we did them at great depth in early sobriety. To keep those alive today, I think, is not a small challenge. How much time have I? 5 minutes. The 4th step. If there ever is a place that is getting too structured, in my humble opinion, it is the 4th step. Everybody's an expert today on the 4th step. They've got, there's just an enormous amount of teaching about the 4th step. I have said 2 or 3 of the last times I have heard 5th steps, I've had people who really rigidly followed the book, and when they came to me to do their fifth step, to me they didn't have what they needed in the process of communicating the fifth step to me. They so mechanically followed the process that they restricted their communication of who they were, what their defects of character were, what their part was in the process. They just mechanically followed the words. I know a lot of people think God wrote the big book and Bill wrote the 12 and 12 in his office. But he deals with the fourth step very differently in the 12 and 12 than he did in the big book, as he deals with the sixth and the seventh step very differently in the 12 and 12 as he does in the big book. I think they're both powerful writings. And what I want you to notice more than anything else is that there isn't just one way to do it. And what I want you to notice is that I think if you do it too mechanically, there's an excitement about having the formula. There's an excitement about knowing about, we used to do that. We did not have near the attention when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous and the groups I was in on the format of how you did a fourth and fifth step. They said, read the big book, read the 12 and 12, talk to me before you go do that, and then go line up a clergy to go do it. They didn't go over your fourth step. They didn't hear your fifth step. Almost ever in the men and women that I knew when I came in, it was done differently, and people still grew and changed and had good lives and all those sorts of things. Today, we're putting too much emphasis on the form. What you want is the substance, not the menu. You eat the menu, you will not get nutrition. Okay? But it is. I'm telling you, a lot of us are eating the menu, and we're wondering why we're not growing. We're wondering why we're not getting the food. Because we got the words, not the principle. Because it's on a piece of paper, not in our hearts. Don't be paranoid that you're going to do it imperfectly. Hell, we've been doing everything else in the program imperfectly. Why not the fourth step? I mean, you can't, because you can't do it perfectly. I mean, who does that perfectly? What I think is important to know is how afraid we are, especially in later sobriety. It's really subtle. I think there's such a need to purge yourself early in sobriety that when he talks about if we don't do this vital step that many of us are going to get drunk, the fourth and fifth step, that there's such a need for us to reconnect. We are so dying of thirst. We are so disconnected from all our relationships, relationship with ourselves, relationship with other people, relationship with God, that we are dying. And it is the taking of the fourth and fifth step that reconnects us to life's source. And I think the need for that is so great that it overcomes the pain and the fear of doing it. And if we have someone hold our hand and help guide us through that, and I think the combination of the fourth and fifth step, but what I tell the people who bring me their fourth step is I try to say, I want you to follow the form of the big book, because first of all, there's a lot of attention on that, and as you go to meetings and people are going to want to know, did you do it with the columns, did you do this? I want you to be able to say, yes, I did it. I followed the instruction. No, but it's not like the book's not inspired. I mean, it's not like it's not important. It's important. But it's not mechanical. But I also want you to read carefully the 12 and 12 and notice the same guy wrote both of them and notice how different they are. And then after reading both of them, if there's something you feel like you haven't communicated it, write it down in your words to communicate with me, and don't feel restricted. One of the things that I think is the most restrictive about the fourth step in the big book is how it keeps using the same words over and over again to describe the emotions and the impact on ourselves, and it feels stodgy and restrictive. I'm listening to guys tell very different experiences time and time again, and it affected my security, affected my relationship, and it gets mechanical when you're down to the 52nd time that he's using the same word. That isn't how we talk. And I don't think Bill meant to restrict this only to those 4 words in communicating our lives. I think he wanted us to feel like we fully communicated our lives. So the fourth step is one of the most important rites of passage in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think when Bill talks about the 6th step separating the children from the adults, I think the fourth step made me feel like I was now no longer a provisional member. I mean, my application had been accepted, that I had done the first rite of passage of Alcoholics Anonymous when I did my 4-step. I took my first 4-step, was very uninsightful. It was a recitation of my horrible behaviors and my wrongs and my, those sorts of things. When I did my second 4-step, it was a little bit better, but I really didn't get much into causes and conditions. My third 5th step, I think, was, of the 6 or 7 that I've done, was probably the most powerful one that I did. But even in that step, as much pain as I was in, I missed pain. I missed fear. Even with all the pain I was in, with doing the very best job that I had, I was almost totally surrendered. I wasn't able to get in touch with how afraid I was. Even with 8 years of sobriety, with all that information. I think the 4-step is vital. I think that in order to do a good 4-step, it sure as hell helps to help the first 3 steps alive. I don't think you should go to the 4-step and start with the 4-step without really going back and examining the conditions so that you bring a state of mind and a state of heart to that process, and I think that will do it. When I get to 6 and 7, I'm at about 50 minutes now.
You're at 45 right now.
Okay, so the 5th step. Today the tradition, to go back to the 4-step. We have, one of the things that we're doing a lot of in our area are step workshops. And what I mean by that thing, that Dr. Paul's pamphlet and which I think is kind of a little bit of a takeoff of something that Mac Cheater did years ago, and the guys, where you go through and you get a set group of 10 or 15 people and you say, okay, we're a group. And for the next 16 weeks, we're going to go through this process. We're going to read the book and take the steps. We're not going to discuss them only. We are actually going to take them. We aren't going to necessarily do our 4th and 5th steps with each other, but we're going to set appointments and do this, and we're going to go through it. So it's a step-taking workshop. And once the group is formed, it's closed. And I found myself, and one of the ideas that we tell people when they're in the group, those of us that were more timers, we say, one of the things we request of you when you get in this group, first of all, that you attend all the meetings. Now, we know that the way the world is, that each of us might miss 1 or 2 meetings in the 16 weeks that we have. But we're going to make a promise to each other that we're relying on each other for our own attendance and participation. We don't want anybody. We always lose 2 or 3 people when we start doing the 4-step. Even with that conversation, even with sponsorship, even with guidance, there are people who are not ready for that process. So we start through the process. And then we request that if you think this process is worthwhile for you, we want you to start one of these groups and do it again sometime with other people. Well, what happens is there's a rash of these things going around, and they want an old-timer at these things, so I found myself in a period of maybe 2 years going to 4 of them. Well, I found myself going to the 4-step, and I'm saying, where did I put this? I mean, I just was not motivated. I'm looking for my old 4-step. I'm not, it's too big a task for me to do twice a year. I'm not ready to do that twice a year. I'm lucky if I'm ready to do a real 5th step every 2 or 3 years. Now, I don't think it's totally mechanical. If I did the 4-step, to bring my 4-step and go do it, but it isn't as worthwhile an experience for me as it is if I have some space. For myself, I use the 10-step to kind of update myself, and I use the 4th or 5th step when I'm really plateaued out. I use the 4th and 5th step. For me, if I think someone said, how often would you like to do a 4th and 5th step? And there are some people who think you do that once and you use 10 for the rest of your life. Not arguing with that. You can use, if you read the 12 and 12, you could do a pretty good job with the 10th step. But for me, in my experience, I do it about every 4 or 5 years. And I do it best when I'm stuck because I'm in pain. Pain seems to motivate me. I'm either dried out or I'm in trouble. And when I'm in that position, I'm just more motivated to do it. The 5th steps that I do today, I do face-on-face with either my sponsor or my spiritual advisor. I know that in different parts of the country they still do it with clergy. I do think we ought to listen to the fact that it isn't absolutely something you have to do with your sponsor. I know that's going to sound like heresy, and I know that there's, in this group especially and in the Pacific group, it is, I think, generally a far more followed thing to do it with your sponsor than anything else. I think unless you have a very, very, very good reason for not doing it with your sponsor, you got to do it with your sponsor. But I think there are situations, and I think the book addresses it, both the 12 and 12 and the big book, that there are cases and circumstances where you may want to do it with the clergy, and I think that that's fine. It is your step. If your attitude is not to avoid something in an experience that you shouldn't avoid, if your attitude is such that I want to take this step and I'm here and I'm fully participating in the step, it's far more important what your attitude is and the heart you bring to it. And I think when you have an open heart and you really want to do the step well, you will not try to avoid something that you shouldn't avoid. Okay? But I do want to say that there are circumstances where I think that people will take it with clergy, and I think that's a valid experience. Doing it imperfectly is better than not doing it. And you will have the opportunity if you feel like you have missed something, and I think if your sponsor doesn't know what's going on in your life, you've got some issues of trust, and you've got some issues with, that you need to examine. That you probably need to correct. And even if you do it with a clergy, there's probably significant things in your fifth step that you're going to want to communicate with your sponsor, period, whether you're doing it with your sponsor or not doing it. And as I say, the fourth and fifth step, I think, are rites of passage. I think that most of us, when we're through with our fourth and fifth step, and we've done a reasonably good job, start to feel reconnected with God and reconnected with the people in our, I felt more than anything else a sense of relief and a sense of forgiveness. I felt a sense of forgiveness for the people who had harmed me in my life without even knowing that was going to be one of the events or one of the promises of that step, and I felt more connected. It was just like taking a warm bath. It was really, each time I did that step, but mostly the first and third time, it was a pretty profound experience with me. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, we'll come back and I'll finish up. I'm an alcoholic. Step 6 and 7. I had the most major change in my sobriety at my 8th year, starting my 8th year of sobriety. When I talked to you about the problems at work, gambling, marriage, parenting, and money, they had all kind of come to a head, and I was really literally at my wit's end when I started to go back through those steps. And I told you after I did my fourth and fifth step, my sponsor wanted me to go to a psychologist. I had a lot of issues around money, success, and failure. My father was a real successful man in my eyes. He was a pretty successful man, period. And he was my hero, and my idea was I'll never be as good as my father, so, and that, I was kind of hung up on that. It seemed like such a tall hurdle to try to, I don't know why I felt I had to be better than my father, I was always comparing myself to my father for whatever reason, maybe because he was my model. And so I had a lot of issues about that. And when I got into the work with a psychologist and I found out how afraid I was, it was like a sex change operation. Nothing looked the same. It was similar to my admission of my alcoholism. When I admitted I was powerless over alcohol, nothing looked the same, including the 2 times I drank early in my AA career. It was never the same. The drinking wasn't the same, those 2 events, and it altered me. Not too long after the work with that psychologist, even during the time of the work with the psychologist, I had a particularly bad day where I got up late, went to work late, left early, got in a backgammon game, I won $600. I came home, missed dinner, missed the AA meeting, came home, got in a fight with my wife, and slapped one of the children. It was one of those days where you like to have it videotaped and sent to the General Service Office to kind of show what 8 years can do for you. And I was thinking, wouldn't you like your sponsor to walk in the door just then, just to see how you were doing? I've had the same sponsor for 35 years. Isn't that cool? That is really... I was thinking about if someone asked Warren to give a 3-hour presentation, he'd say, what the hell would I talk about? And yet he has led me through the program in every facet of my life in the fellowship. He got me active in service, he got me active in 12-step work, he got me active in sponsorship, he got me active in the steps, he got me active in everything that I've done, and he is about as unfancy a guy in that respect of anybody I've met. And I don't think there could have been a better man for me than that man. And his kind of held my hand all the way through, and I'm really fortunate and blessed that I have that guy. His wife was my wife's sponsor, and she died 10 years ago. So Linda's gone through. Then Marcy died, and Vince wants me to tell the thing about Vinoy. I said, I've been in the fellowship so long, I knew Vinoy when she didn't have the V before her name. So that day that I had that fight with my wife and slapped one of the kids, I was in my living room reading some non-conference approved literature, and I said, gee, it happened again. And I said, what do you mean it happened again? Weren't you there? It's your life. I say, yeah, I was there, but it's so habitual. These problems I have are so habitual that it's almost like I go into a blackout and I don't even realize they're happening. And all of a sudden I realized that was a bunch of crap. I realized that I planned my life the way it was. I sounded like a guy who wanted to quit gambling. The truth was I wanted to gamble whenever I wanted to gamble for as much money as I wanted to gamble and not have problems because of gambling. I sounded like a guy who wanted to have a good career. I wanted to work. I didn't like work. I was afraid of work. I wanted money without work. Not a great formula. I sounded like a guy who wanted a great marriage. I wanted my wife's and children's affection without spending time with them. When I came into AA and I took the first step and I had my surrender experience, I stood naked in front of my alcoholism, and looking at my alcoholism naked altered me. If someone said the truth will set you free, well, first it will irritate the hell out of you. That night in my living room, I stood naked in front of my life, in front of my gambling, in front of my sexuality, in front of my husbandness, in front of my parenting, and in front of my work, and in front of my finances. And I realized that I had tried pretty hard to get rid of those defects of character and bring them into balance, and that I had failed. And for whatever reason, usually when I come to the conclusion that I'd failed, I would come to the conclusion that I was an asshole. My wife doesn't like that word. That is the word internally that I felt. That was how I felt. And for some reason that day, and then I'd feel sorry for myself and I'd wallow in the thing. At least I'm good enough to feel bad about what I do, or I don't know what. It was this circular Catholic, goofy, unproductive, neurotic guilt that I had. And all of a sudden I realized that was just exactly where I was supposed to be, and I was given the opportunity to take the 6th and the 7th step of the program of AA. The 6th step said that we were entirely ready to have God remove our defects of character. The 7th step said we humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. I had spent 8 years trying to get rid of them. I don't have the power to get rid of them. I'm the pipe, not the well. It happens through me, not by me. A doctor doesn't heal. He creates an aseptic environment, creates an atmosphere in which healing can take place, and God heals. A farmer doesn't grow. He plants a seed, creates a fertile environment and an atmosphere in which growth can take place, and God grows. And we don't change. We create an atmosphere in which change can take place. The atmosphere, I think, involved in the 6th and the 7th step and the 3 requirements of being honest, open-minded, and being willing. And God changes us. We started a conference quite like this in Minnesota called the Gopher State Conference. And we had David Aronofsky and Wesley Parrish help us set it up, and it's 6,000 or 7,000 people, big conference. And for the first couple of years, we had our favorites back. We had Chamberlain the first 2 or 3 years, and we had Tommy Breen and Mac Cheater and Cecil for the first 5 or 6 years. We just figured out some way to have them do their thing. But Chamberlain used to hold court. And we'd go up to his room, and there'd be 15 or 20 people sitting at this man's feet. I could just listen to him forever. He was such an extraordinary communicator. And Chamberlain, by the way, the man by the name of Chuck C., the book that we see, A New Pair of Glasses, is the transcript of a set of tapes he did at Palo Verde, or I'm not saying the name right, but something like that. But he was a great communicator, and I think altered the communication to some extent, what we have in Alcoholics Anonymous, for the better. He looked at me one day, and I'm sitting down at his feet, and he said, "Son, you're not going anywhere. You already are everything you're ever going to be." And then he looked at me and he said, "I can tell you don't understand that, and you're disappointed by it." And I was very disappointed by it, and I had absolutely no idea what he said to me. But I do today. I have spent 35 years working the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've made enormous changes, and I am the same man today that walked in the door 34 and a half years ago. The process of change has been more a process of becoming who I have always been. There is nothing missing. You are not under-equipped. There is nothing wrong. It is not the Chevrolet, it is the driver. The driver is just fine. You don't need new hubcaps. You don't need a new paint job. You don't need a new radio. The driver is who we be. The driver is connected with God. Indistinguishable, I believe, at the core from God. We are comprised of God, in whom we live and breathe and have our being. The process of spiritual growth, the process of change, is a process of waking up to what is already there. You do not have to. I wanted to become my sponsor. I wanted to become Chuck. I wanted to become Bob White, not Bob Bazans. The last thing I wanted was to be Bob Bazan. The trip is a round trip. The trip, the God of your understanding, is who you are at your very core. It is not a third-party, gray-bearded old man in a cloud or woman in a cloud with rules and judgment. It is you. It is reconnecting with you. It is getting a chance and accessing the gift that you are. Most of us have a special gift, something that we are supposed to put in action in life, and most of us never get it out of the box. It is still under the piano in the red paper with the white bow on it. We never get a chance to use it. The cost of our addiction, the cost of our neurosis, the cost of our ego is not getting to be who you are, not having a life. But it is present, intact, complete, and whole right this minute, and we don't know it. So when I took the 6 and the 7 step, 4 of the major problems in my life disappeared that night. Such is the power of God, and such is the power of the program. Now, I'm the guy who, when I go on a diet, I go buy a pan of ice cream and some cookies. It's already been a bad day. I'm just going to finish it off. I'm probably never going to have ice cream again, so you know where that one goes. If you've been there, you know that sometimes we have experiences that if you don't reinforce them or set up a structure for support of them, they devolve. We sometimes have spiritual experiences. All of us have had a spiritual experience in the first step. If we own that, why couldn't we just apply that to the other issues in our lives that will? Well, one of the reasons is it's daily bread. How many people ate today? Why did you eat today? You ate yesterday. Okay? It's daily. It's daily. Give us this day our daily bread. It's the maintenance of our spiritual condition. When I knew that I had to do something, so I made an appointment with my sponsor about when I'd go to work and when I'd leave work. I turned the finances over to my wife. My wife does not have the issues with money that I have. She had us out of financial difficulty in about a year. She had this technique, she could pay a third of a bill. Damnedest thing I have ever seen. I started dating my wife. I've dated my wife every Friday night for the last 27 years. I had her love and affection. It was everybody else's love and affection I was trying to get. But we set it up and we went out on a real live dangerous date. No one else went out with us. It was our time. She knew that once a week we had each other's undivided attention and it was important. It was maybe one of the most important things we did. We ended up talking all the time about kids and money. That wasn't how we became attracted to each other. We had to start going to Chicago and shacking up and doing some fun things, some different stuff that we did so we could go back and re-experience what we were when we were attractive to each other. And it's been a good thing. I'm just thinking that the last 6 months that has devolved. And I need to get that back. That is not okay. It is, if you go through marriage over a long period of time, you end up in flat spots. And I think I have been in a flat spot and I need to get on that and elevate that a little bit. We need each other's attention. We need to be special to each other. We need to be important to each other. We need to nurture each other. And sometimes we just get about the business of what we're doing and we forget that. We need to be attractive to each other. I spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours trying to learn how to be a parent. I think being a parent is like having a bowling alley installed in your head. I think it is one of the most demanding jobs you will ever experience. But I'm telling you that when I took that 6 and 7 step that night, and over a period of the next 6 months, my life took off like a rocket ship. I went on and I did steps 8 and 9, which I also think are integral to that process. But all of a sudden, the guy who couldn't work started to work. And my partner and myself built a company with 400 employees. We put hundreds of millions of dollars together in real estate investment. And for the next 10 years, everything I touched turned to gold. It was an extraordinary experience. Part of why that happened was the way the market in the world was. It was an extraordinary time from 1975 to 1985. And part of why it was because of the 6 and the 7 step. Why does Bill treat the 6 and the 7 step so compactly in the big book and talk about the 6th and the 7th step as being so profoundly important in the 12 and 12. To me, I have two answers to that, and I don't know if either of them are correct. One of them, I think, is Father Dowling. I think the Jesuits got in his pants in the 7 years of sobriety. And the other is because he was sober and his life was not as manageable as he expected it to be when he wrote the book. And I think he saw that getting entirely ready and humbly asking God was a bigger deal than he thought it was when he was able to write those words in 1938 and 1939. I think it addresses what I talked about in the problems in early and middle sobriety that I had. And I want to tell you how, for me, fear plays into the changes that we hope happen after 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. I think we are, one of the discoveries I have made in my later sobriety is how afraid of change I was, okay, and why I was. You know how I talked about the 4th step in the book being kind of complicated with all the columns and stuff? Pretend for a minute that I'm sponsoring a guy who's 35 years old, married with kids. And I say, look, Bill, you're having trouble with the 4th step. I know it's complicated. You got all those columns. Don't worry about that. Just get your wife, your kids, your mom and dad, your brothers and sisters, your boss, 2 guys from the group, and your neighbors, and bring them over to the house. And I want you to serve coffee, and here's what I want you to say. We have a step in AA where we try to get in touch with our defects of character, and I'm having trouble identifying them, and I'm wondering if you'd help. Do you know why we laugh at that? Almost none of us would call that meeting. Do you know why? We don't want to change. But it's worse than that, baby. We don't want to know. We don't want to know. We train each other. Look, I'll make a deal with you. You don't call me on my crap, I won't call you on yours. We'll talk about the steps and the traditions and the meeting and the group, but you stay out of my face, I'll stay out of yours. Deal? Bad deal. We train our wives. We're not talking about that. Nod your head up and down if you understand that. We're not having, you want to have that discussion? Going to be a tough discussion. You train your kids, what they can say and what they can't say. You train your employees about what they can say and what they can't say. You train your co-workers as to what they can say. You train your sponsees as to what they can say and don't say. And it's very clear to everybody in your life what you're open to hearing and what you're not open to hearing. There is deep fear around change. Scott Peck, I wrote a book called Road Less Traveled. Later on, he wrote another book called Further Along a Road Less Traveled. In that book, there's a chapter on death and dying called The Road to Omaha. In that book, that's after a Carl Sandburg poem called The Road to Omaha. And he is talking about the 5 stages of death and dying that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. He talks about when people go through denial, they get a cancer diagnosis, maybe you don't have cancer, get a second opinion. Anger is, God, why the hell is this happening to me? Bargaining is, please remove this and I'll be your servant. And depression is, and I'm not trying to play doctor, I'm not talking about clinical depression, I'm talking about an appropriate depression due to circumstances. Depression is when you go through denial, anger, and bargaining, and your nose gets pressed up against the impending possibility of your death that you go through. And then he talks about, but if you allow depression to do its work, which by my own experience means grind the ego to dust, you go through depression into acceptance. Now he says most people, when they hear about the 5 stages of death and dying, assume that anybody who dies goes through those stages. They don't. They go through the denial, anger, and bargaining, but the pain of depression gets so great they back away and they recycle continuously into denial, anger, and bargaining, and never get through the pain of depression to the peace of acceptance. And then he said, interestingly enough, that's the same process most of us go through with major change in our life. We don't view change as change, we view it as death. We so strongly identify with our story One of the traditions in Alcoholics Anonymous is we are verbal and we all tell our story. Some of us have fallen in love with our story. And that we so identify with our story that we cannot make some of the, because we think it's who we are. We think the issues in our lives that's who I am. It's what you do. It's behavior. It's not skin and bones. You can change behavior. You can change political parties and not change who you be. You can change behavior and not change who you are. There was a real distinction. My distinction was that I had blanket guilt. And I couldn't change being an asshole. But I'll tell you something. I could stop gambling. When I told the truth about my gambling, it wasn't being an asshole, it was I had a problem with gambling. And when I took that issue and separated the shame out of it and took it as an issue, I could take not spending enough time with my wife and I could resolve that, not just being a jerk. I could take not spending enough time with my children and resolve that, not just being a bad dad. I don't know how to stop being a jerk. But if I'm not spending enough time with my children, I can resolve that issue. The behavior and the problems in our lives is not who we are, it is what we do. It is behavior. We are scared to death of change because we so strongly identify with our stories and who we are that we will not allow ourselves, in many cases, to move beyond it. As afraid as we are, they're familiar. What we fear more than anything else is the unfamiliar. But if you take a look, one of the things Clancy says, one of the great quotes, he has a few that I think are kind of unique to him. One of them is there's no pain in change, there's only pain in resistance to change. No one has had a more powerful experience to the energy produced by change than alcoholics in step one and the stopping of drinking. You couldn't get a much more powerful experience in life than that. But it has devolved into a concept, into an idea, because if it was alive as a principle, we'd be out looking to purge almost all the unworkability in our lives. But the reason that most of us aren't out to purge the unworkability in our lives is that we identify with it, we think it's who we are, and we don't think we can change. We don't have the first three steps alive as we need them today to handle some of the stuff that we need to handle. We got them alive as words, but not as living principles. We have to reclaim the first three steps, I believe, to have that kind of opportunity that we need in the sixth and the seventh step. The eighth and ninth step, I believe, are two of the most powerful steps in the program. As I see, both with some of the men I sponsor and some of the people I go through, and I think I don't do a good enough job with the eighth and ninth step with the guys I sponsor, and I've been trying to improve that. I think that I used to use the example, I say, what if I borrowed $500 from Cliff? And I borrow $500 from Cliff, and I say, Cliff, or let's say $1,000. Cliff, give me $1,000. I got my tax return coming in. I'm just a little short right now. I'll give it back to you in 6 weeks. Well, I get my tax return back if I ever had one, and I don't give Cliff the $1,000. Okay? Well, then I start thinking, Cliff's kind of a jerk. He doesn't need the money. So I got to kill Cliff, because, I've got Cliff going around in my head, and I don't want Cliff in my, so I start killing Cliff. I stop going to the meetings that we go to together. I don't interact with them. Okay? But every time, so 2 years passes and I haven't paid Cliff back. But every time his name comes around on the carousel of my mind, you can just see my lights dim. You can just see the drain on the battery. And alcoholics don't have one of those. They have 50 of those. They wonder why their relationships don't work. Well, one of the reasons is a lot of us don't have our primary relationships in order. We haven't healed a relationship with our parents and our brothers and sisters, and we think we can go out on top of that mischief and garbage and start a new relationship without bringing the load with us from that. I'm a believer that until you have your primary relationships aligned, you're going to have a hell of a lot of trouble starting and maintaining significant relationships as you go forward. We need to resolve those issues. And the 8th and 9th step, obviously in the inventory, but that was where we get the information that we have to bring to the 8th and 9th step. But the 8th and 9th step is a get out of jail free card. It is a freeing of a prison. Most of us, our happiness is knowing who to blame. We go through life blaming. Blaming may be fun, but it doesn't work. It's disempowering. The good news is you got someone to blame. The bad news is you are powerless and at the effect of the person you are blaming. I'm not saying that bad things don't happen. Bad things happen, things that shouldn't happen. I'm not asking that you go back and have bad things happen again. But I'm saying that the program, I forget who the old timer was, that used to say in his talk when the sponsor asked him, well, how much am I responsible for? And the sponsor said, well, we always start with 100%, and if it's any less than that, we'll let you know. One of the most effective things about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is that it empowers you in your own life. It says no, that you don't need anybody else to get sober. You don't need anything to happen to get sober. There is no condition that you need. It is all available to you. It is not conditional. And most of us have lived our lives like they're very conditional, like we're victims, because we were unwilling to stand. So the bad news is that in order to get empowered, in order to have the change happen in your life, you have to take responsibility for everything that's in your life. If you had any idea how powerful you are, that would not be a problem. You have created your life. You have drawn the people into it that you have. You have created the interaction with those people. If we had any idea how much power we have, we would just move through the mischief that we have created in our lives and the pain that it has created and move on to so much opportunity that we wouldn't be able to stand it. And the 8th and 9th step is where we make a list of the people we had harmed and became willing to make amends with them all. I believe that that's an enormous change of heart. I don't think that we could have that change of heart had we not done the 4th and 5th step. We should be in the presence of how many things we have mishandled. And in the presence of that, one of the things that I said that happened to me, I started to feel forgiveness for the people that I thought had mishandled me, because I was about to also go out and ask for their forgiveness. And what I really wanted to do was start to go out and set life straight, to make amends, to make whole, not just to say I'm sorry. I was a great apologizer. I remember my mother was the one, when I went to do a 9th step with my mother said, Bob, I've lived through this. Do I have to sit and listen to it again? Ooh. And it was really a disappointment because I had a whole thing I was going to go through with my mother. And I thought, no, you don't. You know, I don't know how old she was. My mother was a very private lady. It was hard for her to hear some of the things that I wanted to tell her. And it was interesting. Linda and I took the kids on a trip to Europe a few years ago, and we were all together, and they started doing show and tell. And they started, and Linda stopped them in the middle of this and said, are you making amends? And they said, well, kinda. And she said, if you need to continue with this, that's fine, but I want you to know that I don't need to continue with this. And it wasn't like a put down. It was just that we have 3 children in the program. One has 15 years next week. One has 11 years and one has 4. It has been wouldn't it have been a great testimony to the program that when my children needed help, that they wouldn't have wanted the program because of how big a horse's ass I was in my own home? That could have happened. That could have happened. I am so grateful that I was given the opportunity to make the changes I made at 8 years, so that at least it was a cleaner slate for them to come in. When I talk about people being afraid to change, I'm going back and forth because I don't have a plan for this. In my early sobriety, I tried to change and tried to grow, and I failed. So I tried and failed, tried and failed, tried and failed, tried and failed, but I still grew. And then at about 6 years of sobriety, I tried and failed and I stopped growing. There comes a time where you know enough and it's time to change. No more inventories, no more talk, no more information, no more questions. Change. If God wanted us to change, how would he get the message to us? Bad news, probably your spouse, probably your parents, maybe your children, maybe a look when you're yelling at your kid or you go to smack them or something and you look up and you get a look. Maybe that's God's look. Maybe your boss, maybe your coworkers, but the world speaks to you. And the message is change. Most of us don't want to hear that message. Okay. Now when you get to that point, as I say, you start to alter your friends and you start to train people what you can talk about and don't talk about. There comes a time where you have to change or you stop growing. If you stop growing over a significant period of time, you increasingly put yourself in danger, I think, in the program for relapse or for cementing yourself into a very uncomfortable, painful place for a hell of a long period of time. Life is a school. The subject is love. The universe is speaking to us, and what it's requesting us to do is to remove the obstacles we have in our lives to become more loving and more integrated with God and the people around us. All we have to do is be present to what's going on in our lives. We will have all the information we need, and if we had any sense of the power within, we would know that it is nonsense that most of us are putting up with the chaos in our lives today. And that what's available would be so much better than what we have been putting up with. The chicken crap little things that we are just scared to death of are just nothing. So in 8 and 9, we're back to 8 and 9. When I make a list of those people and I become willing, I think I've had a change of heart. But the other thing that's happened to me is I become a cause in my own life. I'm taking responsibility for my life. And as a result of taking responsibility for my life, I have more power in my life. The bad news is I have to take responsibility. The good news is I am more powerful. And when I move beyond that, that's why I think I had the great burst of growth at 8 years of sobriety was after doing 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. I see the great change in most people after they start to the 8th step and they start into their 9th step. That's where I see the power return. The power that those black holes, like borrowing that money from Cliff, do, it drains us of our energy. We have 50 of those. We're lucky we can get dressed in the morning. We wonder why, because most of it, we're not short on equipment. Why are we having trouble putting it in action over an extended period of time in our lives? One of the reasons is because of unfinished business. There's a power in completion. And the 8th and 9th step, I think, restores the power that those black holes suck to be available in your life and empowers your life at a new level. And once that power is restored, you start acting differently, behaving differently, and people see you differently. I go to guys and they're having problems. I'm saying, look, you allow that person to treat you that way. You are a space in which you can be abused. It's a tennis game. Don't hit the ball back. If someone is abusing you, just say, this isn't working right now, and just go get a cup of coffee. Well, when no one hits the ball back, it's not much fun for the person to keep hitting it over the net. You can alter the way people treat you if you wake up, if you're more present to it, if you take responsibility for the fact that in some ways you attract what is going on in your life. The bad news is you have to take responsibility for creating your life. The good news is you can recreate your life, which is what the book talks about. If we are to recreate our life, which is what I think the program of alcohol, what a wonderful way to say what recovery is. The transformational thing that recovery is to recreate our lives. And I say it's coming home. The 10th step is a process, a lifelong process of continuing to take inventory, listening to the universe, so that, as they say, we live our lives in relationships. There is nothing else other than relationships. So if you want feedback on how your life's going, look at the people around you. The more sensitive and present you are to the people around you, gives you access to what you need to do in your life, alter in your life. There is no process. Anybody who is going to be a person who's on a spiritual path, that has to be part of an ongoing look, an ongoing investigation, an ongoing examination of who they are in the business of their own life, is an integral, necessary part of that. In order to attend to that over a period of time, you have to be less judgmental. There seems to be a tendency in your early and middle sobriety to be very judgmental. Things were more black and white to me when I was 10 years sober than they are today. And one of the reasons we're black and white is I got problems today, and I'm 34 years sober, and I wish I didn't have some of those issues today. I smoke cigarettes today. I'm ashamed of that. I hide that. I'm not missing any information about smoking. My wife, or am I missing what my wife and children want me to do? It's not cute, it's not funny. I think it's, a very dangerous, dumb thing to do, and I do it. That's one of about 3 issues I have in my life that I'm not handling very well. So I'm not a guy who has it entirely handled, okay? And it's disempowering to have those around. So when I'm focused on those, it's but I think that to some extent that's the nature of all of us. So sometimes we disempower ourselves with the things that don't work, and we don't focus on the power that's available to us. I hope that the next time I'm here, I will have that handled. You've got to be able to judgmentality. If you continue to be too judgmental, you will not be able to look. If you are too harsh with other people, if you are too angry people are blamers. The angrier you are, the more blame you give other people. That gives you permission to be angry. If you are too angry and too judgmental, you will not have enough compassion to examine yourself. You will not be able to turn the sword on yourself that you turn on others. Forgive us ourselves as we forgive others. Okay? You need to develop, as you go through life and you start getting in front of your own foibles and defects of character, you need to develop the quality of compassion to be able to be present to it. And some of them you almost have to laugh at. But it's this deadly serious business. And so what I'm saying to you is being judgmental is being unforgiving of yourself and others, and it's not our job to forgive others. Leave it alone. And it's not your job to forgive yourself. Leave it alone. You will find the peace and forgiveness as you go through. Judgmentality restricts growth. The 11th step. So through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. I know of no practice that is more beneficial than prayer and meditation. In simplistic ways, prayer is talking to God. In simplistic ways, meditation is listening. What is not there when we are not there is God. There was a psychologist by the name of Gerald May, whose father was Rollo May, wrote a book called Will and Spirit, I think. He talked about unitive moments. He talked about people who take a walk in the forest or going through the woods, and all of a sudden they come to a clearing or a glade, and they are just stopped by the beauty in front of them. He talked about people who are hiking and they go around a hill and they get in front of a mountain, and all of a sudden they are just stopped by what they're in front of. And that all of us from time to time in our lives have had those unitive moments. In those moments, there is nothing wrong. It is all okay. It is okay and we are okay. In those moments, we are not there. Those moments end with our awareness of our watching the mountain. When the thinking kicks back in. The biggest inhibitor to the peace and centering of our lives today is our minds. Most of us identify with our thinking. Thinking should be the junior partner, not the senior partner. You can't throw away your intellect, you can't throw away your mind, but what should be guiding us is your intellect and your spirit. What should be guiding us in our life is the driver, not the Chevrolet. We are not the vehicle. You need a spacesuit, you need a body, and you need an ego to take the trip, but it's not who we are. It's the vehicle. Who we are is an individualized expression of God, intact, whole, complete. What the program promises us is a spiritual awakening. I used to be a monkey. I was a jukebox. You put a quarter in me and you pushed B5, I played B5. Thought, reaction, thought, reaction, thought, reaction, thought, reaction, no thought. I thought there was no choice. I thought if you had the thought and it was what you were supposed to do, that was integrity. That was being connected to who you are. I remember Frank Milos uses the word, you got a Grand Central Station mind. You do not have to get on every train that goes through the station. The Eastern people talk about thoughts being like clouds in the sky. You can watch them pass. The freedom I have today is I get a thought, and today I have a space. And I get to choose in that space what I do. Do you have any idea how wonderful that is for a person who did not have that choice during his drinking and during the first 10 or 12 years or 15 years of my sobriety? It is like being let out of jail. I get to choose. In that space, I am a human being, not a monkey. I get to be present. My kids used to come home with a problem, whether it was being arrested or having a problem in school, getting thrown out of school, and I couldn't be with their problem. Everybody had to attend to Dad. Dad was so goofy that they had to be more concerned with my reaction than the event. Today my kids can come home and there's an issue. Dad is not as crazy as he used to be, and we can attend almost all the time to what is going on rather than attending to Dad. Big change. Not a small deal. When you can attend to what's going on in life, you can be present, and that is the peace that we're looking for. The noise in the head is gone. The connection that we get in meditation moves beyond the purpose. One of the great purposes of meditation is to quiet the mind. What is there when the mind is not there, I believe, is God. When you connect with that and you start to get a sense of that connection, you can then, much like going to meetings, you can start to take that out into the rest of your life. There's a quietness, a stillness, and a peace. There's a difference between, sometimes when you ask people what they want happiness. I love what a man said to me recently. Happiness is conditioned upon your perception that circumstances are positive. Peace and joy are not. You can have peace and joy in difficult circumstances. Happiness is more like a thrill. I'm a thrill chaser. I'm a buyer. I spend a lot of money. Buy this, feel good. Get it for 5 minutes, get it for 10 minutes, get it for a day. Doesn't last. But peace, being centered, relying on your program, having a higher power, being connected with God is a stability. It's less thrilling, but it's long-lasting, and it's quieting, and it connects you with who you really are, and you get a sense like it's okay. And I think that is what we felt like when we had 5 bumps in us. I think eventually what we hope recovery is finding in sobriety what we're looking for in a bottle. And the reason that the program works is that's what it offers us. The process of change in the 12 steps is having had a spiritual awakening. So what happens to us in the process of taking the first 11 steps is we are more awake. I think we still have strong tendencies to be who we are. I think I will always have an issue with spending money. I hope I, get over that, but I'm deeply shallow and I doubt that I'm going to get over it quickly. I have a tendency towards anger, but I don't get in fistfights in luggage lines anymore. Okay. I have a choice. Okay. It doesn't have me. I have it. Okay? So they are simply thoughts going through. I do not have to react to them. I have more peace and space, and what I am is more awake. So if I don't strike children anymore. I mean, if I have a tendency, I noticed the other day on an airplane where there was a crying baby, and I didn't go through, I used to go through, it would be hard for me to explain to you what I went through with a screaming child on an airplane. The main reason of which it reminded me of my children when I strike them. No one likes the sound of a screaming baby, but I think why it was more offensive to me is because it reminded me of events where I was inappropriate. And I was in the airport yesterday, I wear earplugs in an airport, but I'm next to a woman with a baby, and it's crying quite loud, and I was okay. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Peace. One more little area of peace rather than one more area of programmed chaos. So we can recreate our lives. We are not at the effect of life. Nothing is missing. The process of connecting with God is a process of discarding rather than a process of addition. Because you are already with God. There is no place to go. You are already where you are going. As Chuck said, what you are looking for, you are looking with. You can only learn what you already know. When you are sitting in a meeting and someone says something to you, you go, oh yeah. What we learn in the program is stuff that we already know. We have a knower. We have something inside of us that is connected with the mind of God. And you go, yeah. And we have so much more available to us. It's like we're on a rheostat. We have the rheostat turned on. If we went to the process of recovery and the process of spiritual growth is like turning the rheostat up to get more light. Everybody does the best they can according to their light. The process of spiritual growth, this process of spiritual awakening raises your consciousness. It is in the process of raising your consciousness that you can be present to life and present to the God presence within you, and everything is possible in that space. Thank you very much.